Okay, so we're back now. Gun's clean, it's all been washed out. We're now going to move on to the same process, but for the grey. We've done the black already, and all the process that we did for the black is all the same for the grey. There's nothing changing, it's just a colour. So we've got to just wash this out of the black. Comes out great. That windscreen wash really does help if you get it in first. So what we'll do, we'll get again some of that paint in. Because you could even, with the grey and that, you could even fill it up to halfway, then halfway of the Tamiya, and that way then, if you've still got some, you've still got a lot to go down. So, because it doesn't go off. So what we'll do now, I know where that is now, so I'm just going to put 50% in, because I knew where it were on the line. And we'll give it a mix. And you can see it running down, but it is leaving a colour. Yeah, it's leaving the grey on the bottle. That's why I like these bottles. So make sure we give it a good mix. And then again, we'll use the same airbrush. The same airbrush, everything's the same, 0.3 needle. So we've given it a nice clean out. Again, we're still running at the same PSI. Just pour all that in. And what we're going to do, we're just going to put the lid on this. I'm not going to put any cleaner into it because I'm going to have some of that left, so I want to be able to keep it. So we'll put the lid on. Yep. Just make sure you get all the... It comes out like that because I've had to clean it. So now I'm going to turn the brush right down so it's not pushing anything through but air. Then I'm going to turn it up slowly till I start getting a nice mist through. That way I'm in control of how much paint is coming out there. So if I run a bit slow with the gun, I know it's not going to overload it because I've dialed that. If I find that when I'm spraying it's still not enough, I'll just dial it up a couple of little bits. So again, we'll get the spoon. Again, they've all been through the ultrasonic cleaner, so fans on, everything's on, so we'll give it a nice light coat. And then we'll put it under there. Now obviously, because these are white spoons, the grey is going to take a little bit more coverage because it's not as deep. But again, you're putting the first coat on, all you're doing is misting it. Absolutely, it barely got any paint on it. So just mist, because then it'll dry off like that. It's completely dry now. So now we go back in and we give it another light coat. Like so. We mist it back off again. Should I say flash it back off? Well, like I said, the key is not to rush the job, just to put it on in thin coats. It's not like people years ago when airbrushes weren't out, used to use a brush and dip it into the paint and paint it on. It went on a lot thicker, but you never got a nice finish really. Airbrushing puts it on thinner. That's why they don't paintbrush your cars when they spray them, when they put the colouring on, sorry. They don't paintbrush it or roller it, even though you can. They spray it on in very thin coats. And what we do, we just keep going over, just catching up little bits, and then we'll put it back on the flasher. Like I said, it might take 6 or 7 coats with this grey, because I'm not pouring it on thick. I'm only pouring it on very thin, just to make sure that I'm not sat here for 5-10 minutes under flasher. If I put it on thin, I've only to spend 30 seconds, 20 or 30 seconds, just to get rid of that wet look. Once the wet look's gone, I know that my next coat's going to lie on it. it's not just going to look a thick coat. But yeah, I've had a few messages about saying that these primers chip off and they're non-sandable and that. If you put it on in thin coats, you don't really need to sand anyway. If you put it on in thick coats, because if you use an aerosol can, it's the overspray you're creating, and that's what you need to sand off, because it puts like a dust of the colour on everything. Same with the spray booth, that when I tried using a black aerosol, it went everywhere and it left, I had to clean it all off and it left like black soot everywhere. But like now I've got that and it's absolutely smooth, there's no reason to sand that at all. So we'll just go in now just with a little bit thicker, because now we're getting this colour now. Should I say slower, not thicker, because we haven't dialed anything up on there. Like I said, the trick is get it so it comes through your gun, you've got the colour through your gun. That's why I test it on here. Once it's through, wind that back in so you've not got any paint coming through. Then just dial it up a tiny little bit till you get a nice fan spray. That's it. You don't need to wind that, crank it right out to blast that paint out. You'll just waste paint and it'll just destroy everything and go all over the place. Right, so again, it's dried again. So we'll go in again a little bit slower. Again, we're still not going for a full coverage on this, even though it's going grey now. I reckon another 2 coats this will be done, but I'd rather spend the extra 10 minutes putting 7 coats on than putting 3 on, 4 on, and then it just completely goes wrong when I put a colour onto it, because by then the other model you're doing is ruined. You're going to have to go back to basics by stripping it down, and there's some kits you can't do that, so you ruin everything. So you've not only wasted the paint, but you've wasted the money on the paint, sorry, and you've wasted money in the primer, and you've wasted money on the model you're doing. So it's not worth it. Just take your time. It's a learning curve every day with airbrushing. So let's blow some air over that. Yeah, it's gone. I always check for the shiny bits, and I know it's gone. So we'll go again a little bit slower. Making sure I cover it now. It's only coming out very slow is the paint, so it might look like I'm going over and over and over. I'm not. It's only a mist coming out. Obviously you don't want the mist too, so you're not barely putting any paint on. You don't want that. You'll be still there when your wife gets up in the morning, and you've been spraying all night, and she'll come down and go, "What have you been doing all night?" So like I said, you want enough paint to come out so you can see out of the brush, so you can see the colour, but not too much that it's going to overfill the colour, if you know what I mean. So we just keep going now till it's nearly flashed off now. And what I'll be doing with these spoons is, once I've done this, I will be putting them through the dehydrator, the heat chamber, for about 10-15 minutes, just to make sure they're dry through. And because we've only put it on thin coats, it'll dry in no time. Then I can bend the spoons and show you that it doesn't chip if you do it the right way. Right, so we're going to go in now for the final coat, so we can go a bit slower now. Again, we haven't cranked any dials up, still the same 50-50 mix. We haven't put more paint through, it's still a fine mist, but you could go a little bit slower now, but make sure you keep the gun moving. You don't want to stay in one spot too long, because it'll just overfill. So we'll go again, and we just make sure that we put a nice wet coat down. If you keep the gun moving, it won't run. You won't pull it up. So we put a nice wet coat down now. Again, we haven't altered the paint or anything. It's still fine, so you're not overloading it. So as you can tell now, that's what colour it was, and now that's the colour it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave this under the flasher while I clean these out, and then we'll put them in the, I'll then put them in the dehydrator, and then we'll come back at the end and have a look and see how they've dried, and we'll do some bending on them and flicking them and paint tape tests just to see how well that paint sticks on if you do it like this. So we'll come back at the end when we've dried them all off and cleaned up. Okay everybody, we're back at the bench now, and I'll just tilt the camera. What we're going to do now is we've got the black and the grey primer spoons here. Just a couple of things I'm going to go over with you. I'll just move the camera down a little bit so you can see a lot better. That should do it. Sorry about that. Right, when it comes to airbrushing, the best advice I can give you is, obviously you've seen how I thin the paint. I always put it 50-50, maybe 60-40, you know, 40% thinner and 60% paint, but I always get away with it at 50-50 because I put it on in so thin coats anyway. I don't really have a problem. But when it comes to airbrushing, on any airbrush itself, whether it's this style or it's any other, I don't have expensive airbrushes because I buy everything that I get here. I'm not sponsored by anybody, nobody gives me anything, but I buy everything I get. So what the rule of thumb with any airbrushing realistically is, you always mix your paint like I've shown you, you pour it in, and you always crank that out a lot so you've got plenty of paint coming through. And the reason you spray it first on a piece of card or a piece of paper is to get any cleaner out you've put in or any water that's left into the in the gun. Because if you don't and you think you've got it, it's still mixing. As it comes, you might have mixed it perfect in there, but if you've put a bit of water, still a little bit of water or thinner in there, it's gonna mix again into there, and it's gonna come out like an absolute mess. So you don't want any residue going onto your models or anything you spray. So that's why I always crank it up so I get the maximum paint I can off it, pull the trigger and get it coming, spray it onto a piece of paper like you showed me, so I can get the colour. Once I've got the colour, I know it's through, and whatever's coming out of there is coming from there. So there's no pre-mix, there's no mixing in there in the nozzle end at all. Then I crank this right down again, so there's nothing coming through. The trigger won't even move, it'll just pump air through. Then I slowly release it, and this goes for any paint, any primer or anything you're putting on. This is just like a rule of thumb, so you've got a basic to go to. Then I release it and just keep spraying until I get the colour I'm after through the gun, the coverage I'm after. And you just keep, if it's not coming through enough, just keep cranking it up, little turns at a time. You don't need to crank it, you know, you just want to pull it up little turns at a time, just little notches, and keep going, because you don't realise that you might turn it that much, a tiny little bit, but that's a lot of play in the needle, so it's going to throw it out. So if you've cranked it up thinking, oh no, I need more paint, and cranked it up like that, when you do that, it's going to throw the paint out. So we always crank it up in tiny little increments like so, just until we get the colour in we want. Once we know we've got the colour in, then I crank it down a little bit just to get the coverage I'm after. So that's why I use white paper if it's black, because what happens is you'll see the coverage, and you just want it to mist the paper when you spray, not cover it, mist it. We're not going for full coverage. You don't do that with airbrushing. So you go like that on your paper until you get a mist, and it's giving you the colour but transparent basically. Once you've got that, your airbrush is dialed in. You don't then need to touch this again. So it just means that you're not worried about overfilling the paint, overfilling the item with the paint, because it can only go so far because we've dialed it in. So that's what I say about that, how to set an airbrush up. I will do a different video on just setting the airbrush up if people want that. Just let me know in the comments below, and I'll do a different airbrush on. I'll do a test on different airbrushes just to show that the system still works. It doesn't matter what your airbrush you're using. And like I said, whether they're the cheaper ones or they're the expensive ones, you know, we all want the Neos and the Iwatas and all that. You know, we all want them, but they cost so much money when you're purchasing everything yourself and doing your modelling. So you've got to save for these things. So that's why I go for the cheaper ones, especially for the primers. I'm not so bothered because I put everything through this for my primers, whether it be a cellulose primer or the Vallejo primers, the acrylics. Every primer goes through this, because I'm not bothered if this only lasts me 6 to 12 months for £30. I'm not bothered. It's not even worth trying to repair them. You might as well buy yourself another one and get a new one. But yeah, but this one runs, I've got different needles for this one. I've got a 0.2, 0.3 and a 0.5 needle for these, but I tend not to do the 5s because 5s are when you put thicker paints through, so you don't need to thin them down as much. But airbrushing, I've tried putting thicker paint on and it just makes a right mess. And it's too much paint for the model to handle. You lose your profiling, especially on this R34. If I went to spray this, which this is another video that's coming up, so if I went to spray this, you know, even though we scribe the door line out here, even though we scribe that back out to make it deeper, because of the amount of layers we're going to have to put on it, like 2 or 3 coats of primer, then we're going to put 2 or 3 coats of paint on, maybe 2 coats of clear coat on top of it. So you need them a bit deeper, otherwise it just blends all the door frames in. But if you start putting your paint on really heavy and then you still want to give it 2 coats, you're going to lose all profile. It's going to end up like that roof there. It's going to smooth, and you're going to have to start trying to scribe into the paint. And that's why we put it on thinly and take your time with the kits and whatever you're going to be airbrushing. So we've got the grey now. I'll see if we can get a zoom focus there, look. So we've got the grey, as you can tell it's dried really nice, but that's the grey. And then we've got the black there. I've done this marker here, I dropped it while it were going in. I caught it when it were going into dehydrator. Wish it'd focus. No. Does me head in this camera. So that's the black. Oh, it's done it now, look. Move my hand. Right, so that's the black. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put a tape test on these. So I'm just going to get a bit of masking tape. Just rub it in. Because I know these have been through dryer, so... And we rub that one in. Right, so when we peel this, it's not pulled any paint off this spoon. There's no paint on the tape at all. So we know that that's solid. And then pull it off the grey. There's no paint on there. There's not even a mark on the grey at all. And so we know that they take the tape test, so we know that it's a solid paint. Because we've done it in thin coats, we've allowed the paint and dried it between the coats under the flasher. We've allowed it to key one layer to another layer. because if you put it on while it's still shiny, like I said in the video, if you keep putting it on top of that, you might as well just go over, crank that dial right up and just go in one coat. But you're never going to get the finish you want. It might look great for the first time you've done it, and you might think, yeah, I've done it, it's covered. The thing is, you can't put a tape test on it because it'll just peel it off. So it's not really worth it, really. I'd rather just do it in thin coats like I've explained. Now, as for cracking and that, I'm bending these spoons right over now. Right over. And there's not one crack. It ain't fell off or anything. It's not chipped. It's absolutely solid is that colour on there now. And we'll do the same again. Yep. Absolutely solid. Oops, I've just broke the spoon. That's because it's a good example anyway. You break the spoon before it breaks the paint. But there's nothing actually on the... no cracks or anything on the paint itself. Normally when you get cracks and you get chipping, it's because you've put the paint on too thick. So this is only thin layers what are on here, so there's not much of it to damage really. But if you put it thicker, more paint, it gets thicker and thicker. When you bend that spoon, it's got maybe half a mil of paint on, so it's bound to crack. It's like putting filler onto a piece of paper and then bending the piece of paper. It's going to crack the filler because it's too thick. So that's the only way I can explain that really. But I've done the test on these Vallejos now, and they're absolutely... I'm bending that right over. I'm not bothered about the spoon, but I have literally folded that. I've actually snapped it. I've folded it and the paint is still on. It's not cracked, it's not fell off or anything. So even when you do that, it's literally done nothing. So it just goes to show, I know I've smashed them up now, but just to show you that it doesn't crack if you put it on. It's not chipped or anything along this line. But if you put it, it just goes to show that if you thin it down properly, then I never go above 50% in thinning this paint, this primer. If you start going, you know, you're 60 thinner and then you're 40 paint, you're ready for trouble. 50-50 is your limit really, before you start altering the actual mixture of the paint, and you'll never get the stability out of it. So I go for that. I can't stop smashing up. I'm just trying to prove that. Look, it hasn't chipped along the end or nothing. It's still absolutely solid. So go slow with your paint. Put your 50-50 mix in as a minimum, as a max, sorry. Don't go any more than that with thinner. And then put it on in really, really light coats. It might take you 6 to 7, maybe 8 coats to get the colouring you want. Like it took more to get the grey than it did the black, because the black's a deeper colour, the pigments are darker. So you've just to make sure that you just take your time and just build the layers up thinly. That way you're still not putting as much paint on as putting it on thick. If you crank that up and put 2 layers of that on, it's still thin. When you've even looked at it now, you know, it's still thin. It's barely on the actual thing, but it's covered enough for us to... But I've just bent that in complete half now. There's nothing. Yeah, so I'm happy with that. But it's never let me down, this way of doing it. But again, it's all about the understanding of primers and understanding of spraying. Now, I'm no sprayer, but I learnt how to use an airbrush by trial and error. So what you can do is you can take this information and just do, and you adapt it to the will of what you need, really. This is just a fundamental. I can't stop smashing them up. Now, when it comes to the drying and the cleaning process, now I'm just fortunate enough that I do have an ultrasonic cleaner, and I've got a dehydrator. Now, they're not expensive. You can buy them. The dehydrator were about £25, and the ultrasonic cleaner were about 130, because I got the 10 litre one. So but you don't need them. It's just I like to have them because it's faster for cleaning and it's quicker for drying. Like to do these videos, it's quicker to dry the product out than waiting for it. Now, don't get me wrong, to clean the item you've got, whether it be a model like that or plastic spoons, you could just put it in some warm water, clean warm water, and just rub it all down with a nice soft sponge and just give it like an old toothbrush, just to give it a clean, to get rid of any mould, grease, release agents that they put into the machines to mould these, and you just give them a really nice clean. And when it comes to drying them, you just leave them, you just give them a damp down with a bit of paper towel and you just leave them to air dry. But I found that with doing it that way, I had to leave them even when they felt dry. I didn't want to take that risk of painting them and the paint coming off, because in one at gaps there's a little bit of a drip of water that I forgot, so I couldn't take that risk. I was leaving them for nearly maybe 12 to 24 hours before I could do it. So what you tend to do is wash them on a night and then give them a shake off, a damp down, and leave them overnight. And then when you get up or you get ready to do it the next day, it's dry, just give it another blow over and blow over with airbrush with some air and get everything out. But I just like the dehydrator because it does it within 20 minutes, maybe 10 minutes on some things. So that's why I went for the dehydrator, because for these videos it makes it easy. I can make them in the same night really, or the same day. I'm not waiting around for another 8, 12 hours, 24 hours for this thing to dry before I can move on to the next stage. So that's what this video is about. If there's anything you don't understand or you need me to go through more, whether that would be the dehydrator or the ultrasonic cleaner, there is a video on my channel about them already. But if you need me to go into more detail about a certain item, I will do. If you need me to go into a different video of how to set up the airbrushing and use different airbrushes with this product or with the paints, and how the same layout will always go, the same principle will always stand, that you put it on thinly, even with your colours you put it on thinly, and how I thinned it and everything like that. So I hope this video helps and makes people understand airbrushing a little bit more. But it's just to get rid of the theory of the comments that I've been getting and reading that the paint chips off and it flakes. It's because it's so thick on the model itself, which I've just proven that now, because I've thinned the stuff down for 50%. So it's really thin paint and I've put it on really thinly, and it's still not done it. Even when I've snapped the spoons up, it's still not broke and cracked or anything, because the paint is still, even though I put 7 coats on, it's still thin paint that you've put on. So that's it for this video, and we'll look forward to the next one, and hopefully I can get cracking. I've done all the chassis on this now, so it's all painted up and everything. So that video will be coming up, then we'll be moving on to the next video, which is the interior, and then we'll be moving on to the body. I just have to wait for the paint to come for this. I've ordered it. It's Midnight Purple, so Nissan Midnight Purple. So this is why I've got that thing of the way I do my airbrushing from primers, because that paint wasn't cheap at all. It were an expensive paint just for a model. It cost nearly twice as much as the actual model cost me. So the last thing I want is to destroy the paint by messing up the primers. So apart from that, take care guys, see you later.